Welcome. Good morning to this Rotterdam Maritime Capital webinar on autonomous shipping. My name is Jorn Douwstra. I will be the moderator of today, and I would like to welcome my esteemed guests who will introduce themselves shortly in a minute. And so we're going to talk about what are the key challenges to make innovations like autonomous shipping possible. And this is one of the questions we'll address today. So let's talk. The world is becoming more and more digital, and so is the maritime world. And autonomous shipping is a development that we've seen coming up after various experiments on, for instance, road autonomous driving. And we will discuss how those innovations transfer to the maritime setting. So we have different maritime experts here that can help us discuss how the legal aspects, the finance aspects, and the insurance aspects will impact this world. And we are working towards a safe, efficient, but also a more sustainable maritime future. And the industry needs the help of these maritime business services. Which steps need to be taken to make autonomous shipping possible? How can sectors like finance, insurance, and legal help accelerate these technological innovations? And what collaboration are needed? But let me first introduce the speakers who will discuss the challenges facing the maritime industry and how we're going to move forward. Dr. Frank Stevens, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning to all viewers at home. My name is Frank Stevens. I've been a practicing lawyer for almost 20 years. And then I moved into academia. I'm now an associate professor at the Erasmus School of Law here in Rotterdam, focusing mainly on maritime and transport law, also a bit of general commercial law. And within that field of maritime law, I'm also interested and trying to follow all of the developments in autonomous shipping, both at sea and in inland waterways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Willemijn Puts.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Willemijn Puts. I am a maritime lawyer. I work for Bank van Leeuwen Advocaten, which is a maritime law firm here in Rotterdam. My main focus is sea shipping, both wet and dry shipping, as well as the non-contentious and the contentious cases. I monitor the developments with regard to autonomous vessels closely. I find it highly interesting, and it gets me very excited to see what the possibilities digitalization and automatization in general can bring to this industry. And therefore I'm a close follower of everything that's going on there.
Thank you very much. Michael de Visser.
Yes, my name is Michael de Visser. I work for Nibc Bank, which is a Dutch bank running out of The Hague. We have three large pillars in which we operate. That is private mortgages, asset-backed financing, shipping, real estate, and digital infrastructure. And we do platform financing via subsidiaries like Bequip, a leasing company, and automotive leasing company, Yescar. And we have a focus on Northwest Europe. So the maritime industry is something that we have been operating in for 5 decades. So hopefully I can contribute a bit to this conversation.
Thank you very much. And joining us from a live video link, we have Charlie Weatherall. Charlie, could you please introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, good morning, everybody from London. So I've been an underwriter at the Ship Owners Club for the last 7 years on the Netherlands and Belgian books of business that we have. And ship owners are one of 30 P&I clubs, which is protection and indemnity insurance. We provide third-party liability insurance to owners and operators. So we typically cover all your usual maritime claims, such as crew illness, injury, or in some cases death as well. Passenger risks, collision, elision, so like if we're hitting keys or anything fixed or floating, as well as pollution, wreck removal, cargo. And ship owners' niche in the insurance sector is small and specialist craft. So we have a lot of tugs and barges, dredgers, vessels that service the oil and gas and the wind farm industries. So this is where ship owners fit really well into sort of the autonomous space, which for the time being is very much a small and specialist sector. Obviously hoping this will grow in the future, but for the time being it fits with our underwriting appetite perfectly. We were the first club to create an autonomous policy wording, and we've now got around 50 vessels entered with us that are autonomous since 2018.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you all. Before we start the discussions, we would like to first show you a couple of videos with some reflections from the perspective of Professor Rudy Negerborn of the Delft University and the Harbour Master Harmen van Dorser of the Port Rotterdam Authority about the status of autonomous shipping and what the future could possibly look like.
Well, if I look at the developments over, let's say, the last 20 years, about 20 years ago, artificial intelligence and autonomy were much studied in an academic setting. And what you see over the last, well, maybe 10 years, first the introduction of autonomy for cars. Everybody has heard about the autonomous cars that are starting to be introduced. And the last 6-7 years, this is also starting to be moved to the water side. We want to know what can autonomy bring on the water side and what ground challenges can it help to relieve. How can we include the regulations of the waterway in an electronic form such that they respect rules if necessary? So in this setting here, we have kind of created a safe setting also for doing unsafe or quite challenging experiments. And I think that's really a nice feature of a lab like this.
We created a vision on 3 elements. We have digital situation awareness, where a digital object needs to see its surroundings. The next is interacting objects. So we have objects communicating with each other, but also interacting with other objects. And the third is, well, decision support tools. So as the object, the autonomous ship, should take a decision. But the nice thing is how does that interact with humans? So the human element of knowing what an object is going to do is very important. So that's the 3 pillars we are building up our system on autonomous shipping in Rotterdam.
Besides the technological challenges, there are also, for example, legal aspects. Is an autonomous ship a ship? Maybe that sounds like a strange question, but depending on the legal conditions, which can also change from one country to another, the definition of a ship varies. So there are all kinds of legal rules and regulations that need to be checked for compliancy with these concepts.
Well, I think those videos already pose a lot of interesting questions. So first of all, Frank, is a ship still a ship in a legal sense?
Well, that is indeed, and Professor Negerborn also mentioned it might seem like a strange question, but it is indeed a good question, because there is no uniformly accepted definition of what a ship is. It's not on the international level, there's no general definition, but even on the national level, even within the Netherlands itself, there is no standard uniform definition of a ship. Dutch law has several definitions of what a ship are. Now, luckily for us, most of those definitions are quite broad and quite general. They generally do not explicitly require a crew on board of a vessel. So I would say that by today, in the beginning, there was a bit of discussion among the authors as to whether an autonomous ship would still be a ship in the legal sense. I think that by now, almost everyone agrees that indeed, in almost all the cases, those autonomous vessels will indeed be ships in the legal sense of the word.
Okay, well, that's good to learn. And what's your perspective on various types of autonomous shipping? For instance, we have remote ships or fully autonomous. What kind of are those vessels still alike, or do you think they different legal aspects will account for them as well?
Well, indeed, there are certainly different levels of autonomy, and you can define those different levels of autonomy in all sorts of different ways. And there are already several instances that have proposed definitions of levels of autonomy. That is primarily a technical issue. From the legal point of view, the main or the most important difference is between remotely operated vessels on the one hand and fully autonomous vessels on the one hand. Why? Because if you're talking about a remotely operated vessel, then there is still a human being, no longer aboard the ship, but in a control center ashore somewhere. But there is still a human being who is, in a way, controlling the ship. Once you start talking about fully autonomous vessels, well, you will still have someone who has to tell the ship that it has to go from, let's say, Rotterdam to New York. But further than that, there will be almost no human intervention, almost no human action, unless something really dreadfully goes wrong. And then, of course, humans will reappear in the picture. But from a legal point of view, remotely controlled vessels still have this human element, be it in a different way than we're used to. Once we start talking about fully autonomous vessels, then the human element almost completely disappears.
And you just mentioned when something horribly goes wrong with an autonomous ship, then the human element comes back into the picture. Who's then still liable? What is there already a view on that from a legal perspective?
Who is liable? That's the million-dollar question, of course. Well, that's what we lawyers get excited about, and that's what we are paid for. Well, I would say, because obviously, once you have new developments, once you see new technological developments appear, the question, of course, is, well, how is the law going to deal with this? And liability is one aspect. That's basically the second step. And the first step is more or less the regulatory aspect. Ships are, like cars, by the way, are subject to all sorts of technical rules. What the bridge design has to look like, what kind of equipment has to be on board of the ship. There are all sorts of regulatory technical rules. The very first question is, to what extent can an autonomous vessel, an unmanned vessel, comply with these technical regulations? Imo has done in the recent past what they've called a scoping exercise. They have looked at a whole list of these international conventions and tried to define where the issues are, where the problems are. That scoping exercise has now been completed, and there is a document out from the IMO that you can look up. It's accessible online. Gives an overview of the relevant conventions and where the problems are. This is going to be the first step. Certainly, once you progress beyond purely the testing stage, once you progress to a really commercial operation stage, you will need to comply with these regulatory conventions. Once you're there, then, well, we all hope for the best, of course, but just like aviation shows, even in a very advanced industry like aviation, there are still things that go wrong. So even also with autonomous vessels, there will be things that go wrong. And then, as indeed you correctly point out, then we will have the liability issue. I personally think that the rules on liability and the basic principles on liability that we have today will translate, and there will be some bumps in the road, of course, but will translate without too much difficulty to autonomous vessels. We'll have to rethink the principles and see how these principles apply to a new reality, but I don't think we will have to fundamentally change the underlying principles of liability. And then maybe there are even a number of rules and regulations that don't need to change at all. For example, think about carriage of goods by sea. Well, the convention that deals with that, the Hague Visby rules, the Hamburg rules, they basically tell you you have to deliver the goods at destination in the same order and condition. But whether you do that in a rowboat or in a steamship or in an autonomous vessel, that basically doesn't matter as long as you succeed in bringing the goods to destination in the same order and condition.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, and I'm glad to know that it doesn't matter if it's a 19th century clipper or a modern container ship. What are some of the leading examples in autonomous shipping on liability or on legal aspects? Apart from the IMO regulations that you already mentioned, do you have an idea about that? Are we as a Dutch leading the road, or are we lagging behind?
I wouldn't say that. Would certainly not say that the Netherlands is lagging behind. I mean, as far as I'm aware, we're currently still in the stage of testing and experiments, and a lot of, or at least some countries, including the Netherlands, have taken legal action, have taken statutory action to make that kind of experiments possible, because that's basically the very first step to basically create a sort of not only a physical testing ground like in Professor Negenborn's laboratorium, you also need a sort of a legal testing ground where people can try out things without being afraid that the water police is going to stop them and fine them for doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So the Netherlands has taken steps in that. Several other countries have indeed taken steps to allow such experimenting, such testing. There are some conventions, such as, for example, the SOLAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea, that in the convention already have some possibilities to allow for equivalent solutions. So you have a sort of a standard solution that the convention prescribes, but the convention also allows you to, in some circumstances, to apply equivalent solutions that are not explicitly explained in the convention itself.
Interesting. And I was wondering, you mentioned various international conventions as well as local or national law. Is this also a topic that can be addressed as sort of a supranational level, maybe in EU committee or something else, or is it either IMO or national?
No, it would. The European Union would certainly be able to play a role in this respect. I've already mentioned the Imo Scoping Exercise. Well, one of the outcomes of that scoping exercise was that the IMO said we should probably move towards a MES, Maritime Autonomous Surface Ships, a MES code, a special convention, an international convention, and of course, dealing with these kind of autonomous vessels. We have already talked about the national level, that is certainly true, but regional organizations like the EU most certainly can play a role in this respect. And we've seen in the past that the European Union has indeed stepped in and made its own rules when they thought that the international community was not moving forward quickly enough or was not moving forward in the right direction. So it is indeed very possible that the EU will at some point step in, yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let's widen the discussion a bit to the entire panel. And topic one for the discussion will be which challenges lay ahead towards an autonomous future. And I think it would be good to get Charlie's perspective on which challenges does the industry encounter from an insurance perspective. Insurance, of course, doesn't like unknown risks. So, Charlie, how to overcome this barrier?
Yeah, so there's a number of challenges for us when it comes to looking at autonomous vessels. One of the first ones is identifying quality tonnage, and sort of the lack of universal operating standards that Franco just alluded to then. So historically, a lot of our risk analysis on vessels, we usually look at flag and class as two key indicators of quality. Flag obviously offering the safety and the manning requirements, and class looking at the build quality and the frequent surveys that we have. But we've seen a lot of the autonomous craft don't have either a flag or a class. So we've had to review each on a case-by-case basis, which means we do have to sort of change the way we've looked at underwriting. Normally where we'd look at, as I said, flag and class, we've had to look at other risk assessment points. So one of the first ones we look at, and a lot of the autonomous craft we've seen so far have been UK-based. So one of the things that we require is that the vessels are compliant with the UK Mass Code of Practice. At the time being, this is a voluntary code of practice. You don't have to comply with it, but we've sort of taken the stance that prudent operators and owners would likely be compliant with the code of practice. Another thing that we also have to check now is sort of the operational range of the vessel. So how far can the vessel go? If it is one that is operated shoreside, how far from the shore can it be and still be operated satisfactorily, and where the vessel's operating as well. Another challenge, obviously, is the level of autonomy that, again, Frank had just mentioned, with the 4 degrees of autonomy. Each has a different sort of rating, whether some processes are automated or whether it's remotely operated shoreside with or without crew, or finally if there's sort of no human involvement whatsoever and we're just a destination is imported and sensors and satellites do the rest. So we have to consider that. Another big challenge that we have as well is cybersecurity. And we sort of stress to our assureds that they must fully understand the implications of not having a proper cyber security policy in place. And for us, it's not necessarily about just having a piece of paper with a policy. It's not just about compliance. It's about understanding the policy and implementing it on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. We also have to consider the sort of the experience of the builders and of the operators of the vessel itself. And a lot of this sort of challenge that we have is related down to trust. We have to place our trust in a lot of people when it comes to autonomous craft, in the builders of the vessels, so that it works correctly, in the owners and the operators, that they know how to operate these autonomous craft. Obviously, it's a very new industry, so we need to ensure they can operate them correctly. Also, on the software providers as well, we're putting our faith in these vessels which do have no human involvement, that they can operate correctly and they're not going to crash into anything. And one of the other challenges as well is just, as I said, as the market is so new, we don't have sort of historical claims data, which obviously serves a huge role in pricing risks. Without that claims data at the moment, we are sort of taking a shot in the dark as to where we need to set our pricing until the market grows and there are significant claims. We will very much, in some sense, it is a little bit of a guessing game where we are on the pricing side. But as you mentioned, relating to insurance not liking unknown risks, I mean, if we were to know 100% of everything before we under a risk, then we'd have about 5 vessels entered in the club. So there's always going to be an element of risk involved. And as I mentioned before, ship owners are a mutual P&I club, so we're owned by our assured. So we do everything that we can to support them. And as we are a small and specialist insurer, it fits perfectly with the autonomous space. So we're extremely keen to put out our autonomous wording that we did. We were the first ones to put it out. And as I said, we've got 50 craft entered now. So it is very much pushing forward. And I don't think that the unknown element will really create a barrier to entry, and I'm sure that in the coming years other clubs may follow suit with autonomous wordings, and expect it to grow significantly.
Well, thank you very much. Does anybody of you would like to reflect on some of the topics that Charlie addressed? Maybe Willemijn, you can.
Well, yeah, it is. Some things are concerning, the fact, like Charlie mentioned, that there's no claims history. We don't know exactly how it will play out. The idea is that autonomous shipping will be safer, for instance, for navigation, more efficient also. And even though I have complete faith in all the technical people who actually designed this and built this, it's still a matter of testing and trial and see how things go. So and then for me personally, I'm often called in when something already went wrong, and we have to try to limit the damage as much as possible. And so that's the moment when you start looking into what happened, and where does the liability, and how could this have gone wrong. And that is now you have some benchmarks, you have some guidance in, for instance, case law on how to deal with this, and you have guidance in like regulations and laws. But for autonomous shipping, that will be a bit new, even though, like Dr. Stevens already pointed out, it is actually for liability issues, the current regulation seems to be okay-ish, I would say.
Yeah.
It needs to, well, it needs some amendments, but okay-ish. Yeah, that's going to be interesting. The first time that an actual claim happens.
Yeah, and Charlie also mentioned the cybersecurity aspect. Is that already also sufficient in current law? Maybe Frank or Willemijn?
Well, maybe before going into that, Charlie did, and I'm quite happy that he did. I said, well, it's not about having a written policy, it's about how you're assured to really apply that. And that is very true. Cybersecurity is primarily a state of mind. It's about thinking safety, thinking cybersecurity. And that is something, certainly when you are dealing with autonomous vessels, the Internet of Things, etc., that really is something that has to be applied right from the very first design stage. If you first build your autonomous vessel and you're ready to launch it, and then you have this afterthought, oh, but cybersecurity, well, then you're going to get screwed. I mean, pardon my French, but that's how it is. Cybersecurity really is something that needs to be, I would even say, on top of your mind, in the very foremost in your mind, right from the very design phase. And then once you get to a finished product where you have incorporated the cybersecurity and nevertheless something does go wrong, then indeed we will go back to liability principles. But as I said before, I would say that the basic principles that we already know will simply apply, and we would as lawyers, as judges, basically try to go back to the design phase, to the implementing phase, and say, well, did this programmer, did this security expert, did he do a job that as good a job as we could have expected from him?
Mm-hmm. And does that have any implications for you, Michael, in how you finance these innovations?
Well, similar to Charlie in the insurance world, banks do not like uncertainties. I think the old saying is that we finance concrete and insure it underwater against fire. So, and any new innovation provides a certain uncertainty on the business case that we need to finance. And I think, we depend heavily on the insurances. What if there is a collision? What if there is a hijack? What if there's a total loss? Then, the bank is paid, the loan is repaid by the insurances. So we are also in close connection, of course, with insurance companies in that respect to see what we can do and what we can't do. Mm-hmm. The same also is what is the operational excellence of a vessel, that uncertainty, because ultimately the loan needs to be repaid, and you can only repay it if you have income with the vessel. So what we see now is in our vessels, they have 99% operations. There are hardly any idle days because they have operational excellence. So I think these are aspects that as a bank, we really need to see what the track record of these ships is, and we don't have that track record, and that provides uncertainty.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I just received 2 questions from the audience. Thank you for posing these questions in the chat. So who ultimately defines when a vessel is a ship? I think Dr. Stevens.
Well, at least that's a question that's easy to answer. The court that will ultimately deal with the case. That court, and which court that's going to be, that depends on all sorts of sometimes quite complicated rules. But once you know which court you have to go to or which court you can go to. It will be that court that then decides what is or what is not a vessel. And obviously, one court in one country might possibly arrive at a different solution or a different answer than another court in another country. Certainly in the first stages, I would guess that after 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, there will be some sort of common denominator, and there some general form will be created. But for now, it will be the court that deals with the case.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think the follow-up question to that is also which countries are already the furthest in making the legal adjustments for making autonomous shipping, or the experiment of autonomous shipping possible?
Well, I know, for example, that both the Netherlands and Belgium have introduced at least some rules that allow experimenting, etc. The UK has a sort of a working group, exploratory group that is, I think, quite far. Charlie mentioned the mass code, which is not binding legislation, but at least it's a voluntary code. So in way of legal developments, I would say that the UK is quite advanced at this point.
Okay, well, that must be good to for you, Charlie. This topic is about which challenges lay ahead towards an autonomous future. What would be for you, Michael, the number one challenge looking at autonomous shipping? Is that lack of track record that you already mentioned, that operational excellence?
Correct. As a bank, you finance assets, and generally we see that there is value preservation in the assets that we currently finance, because we know what the 5-year second-hand value is, we know what the 10-year second-hand value is, we know what the scrap value is. So that gives certainties in how you structure a loan for your client to buy a ship.
Yeah.
And if you have new technologies, then first of all, the ship can be more expensive compared to a conventional ship. How are they going to repay that? Is there a market that pays an increase compared to today's freight rates? Or is there a guarantor? Or is there an insurer who's going to insure it, or a subsidy? These are all things that we then need to take into consideration, because if you pay more than a conventional ship, it needs to be repaid over the years. And the second thing, of course, is if you have this value, maybe it becomes obsolete over time, because it's not the technology that was the one that is elected in the longer term. Mm-hmm. So you see that, for example, with electric cars. You know, one car manufacturer started with 3-phase and another with 1, and now everybody has 3-phase. What is the second-hand value of a car with 1-phase electricity or charging? So you see exactly the same, of course, in autonomous shipping or in propulsion discussions. So what we see is that the rule of thumb over the years is that if 30% of the ships has a certain spec, then it has room to change the market. But if it's less, it might disappear. What is the value of our collateral? Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting question. How do you look at that from a ship owners and insurance perspective, Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are a number of challenges, but I think and as Max said, there is numerous unknowns as to where the shipping industry will be in sort of 10 years. And it's very much the same from an insurance perspective. I mean, everybody to some extent is taking a shot in the dark, whether it be providing loans or providing insurances. We don't know where the vessels will be in 10 years, in 20 years. I mean, from an insurance perspective for us, although there are a number of challenges that I mentioned before, there's also a number of pros to it as well. I mean, for us, around 40% of our claims relate to crew injury. And then looking at claim causation, over 50% is human error, with a further 20% being illness. I mean, sort of 70% of our claim causation has the potential to be mitigated without the crew on board. And obviously, we don't have crew fatigue if someone's operating shoreside or weather effects. So although there is a number of challenges, I think there's certainly pros and positives that we can look forward to, and that's sort of how I say it's worth taking these risks to a certain extent, just to see where the industry goes and support it in any way we can.
Thank you very much. I got another question from the audience for you, Michael. Does NIBC already have investments in autonomous ships?
No, we don't have that because we focus with the shipping team on conventional ships. And I think that innovation, I have not seen autonomous ships yet that came on our desk. And if you look at the innovation itself, you talk more about manufacturers or R&D companies that I think are looking for financing. And that's not something that we as NIBC finance, unfortunately.
Okay. But that might be
a very interesting market.
Yeah,
absolutely. Rotterdam obviously is one of the most innovative cities in the world. So I'm sure that there are a lot of companies that might be serviced, but we are not there yet.
Okay. Well, I think that's a interesting bridge to the next topic that we want to address. So the second discussion topic is that the perception is that the maritime industry is very conservative, and how can we embrace the change and make those innovations possible? So and you already talked a bit about your role as a capital provider, and when there's no money, nothing happens. But how to come up with special funds and loans is that with those new markets? Is it something that you're looking at?
Well, yeah, I think you have to look at our role in the total funding process.
Yeah.
And the bank generally, like I already said, we finance when everything is a done deal. The whole R&D, the whole innovation, I think that is a completely different type of financing. So you talk about angel investors, you talk about government, you talk about subsidies. Different returns. Banking is zero risk. So at the end, when there is a product and the product is good and it has a track record, I think banking, financing is something that you can do. But the whole process before, there is enough money around the world to do it, but you need to pay, of course, the right price for it. Yeah. And that is still expensive. So there is, I think, where the government can come in. And there are a lot of initiatives. We have the Groeifonds, the growth fund of the Dutch government. I think it's like 20 billion for research, development, innovation, infrastructure. So I think there are enough funds around that you can tap, but you have to have a good idea.
Yeah. So your perception at the moment is that there are enough funds in the market to stimulate these innovations.
Yeah, and I just joined a validation commission because there are so many ideas. So the question is also from a financial perspective, but sustainability perspective, how to choose from all these initiatives. There are so many initiatives. And I think that is where at this moment the difficulty is. We all have ideas, and it needs to funnel into a few ideas that are successful.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And who do we think will take the lead? Can we already adjust the legal barriers right now as a country? You already spoke a bit about that, but I would like to hear your perspective as well, Willemijn.
Yeah, we're talking for the Netherlands. We can. The Erasmus University here in Rotterdam, they did a research as to what extent the Dutch regulations with regard to inland shipping and seagoing shipping have to be amended in order to make autonomous shipping possible, to commercialize it. So not only as an experiment. And this research was done for the Ministry of Waterway Infrastructure. Thank you. The outcome was actually quite positive. That they said, well, it doesn't look so bad, and they had some suggestions on what should be amended. And the current caretaker, the minister, said that she sent a letter to Parliament I think it was back in March, saying like we want to amend these regulations, and we're going to come up with a proposal. To date, we have not seen the proposal. It was supposed to be this year that Parliament would at least take a look at the draft, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen.
We still have 2 weeks until Christmas recess, I think.
So probably will be next year, hopefully.
Yeah.
But it's I think from the Dutch perspective, the regulatory challenges, excuse me, are maybe not that high.
Okay. And you would like to reflect on that?
Well, maybe not an addition to that. I mean, both the insurance side and the financing side have already said that they don't like uncertainties. Well, legislators don't really like uncertainties either. So it's a bit hard to already legislate if you don't know what is coming. And it also goes back to the operational excellence and the earning capacity of vessels. I mean, I think from a technological point of view, autonomous shipping is most certainly possible. I mean, we're sending spaceships to Mars and to Jupiter and whatever. So from purely technological point, we can do incredible things. It will ultimately come down to, is there really a commercial business case for autonomous ships?
Yeah.
How much is it going to cost, and which costs can we save? Which claims can we avoid by going to that? And we might see autonomous ships in some sectors, like short leg ferries, for example, but not in high sea shipping. So if you don't really know yet how that is going to work out, it's quite difficult, I think, for a legislator to already change or adapt everything that would need to be changed.
Yeah, but I think also if you look at, I always like to look at other industries. And I think the automotive industry is a very good example, because there, the whole change to autonomous driving and also to battery-driven cars was driven by entrepreneurs. If you look at Tesla, they are now bigger than, I think, the top 20 car manufacturers worldwide, because they have been able to convince the regulators. And I think Microsoft is the one now doing all the autonomous driving for cars. You know, big corporates that are putting a lot of money in R&D to change the market and change the world. And I think that is also something which might step up in the maritime industry. We always look at the owners. Yeah. It's the same with the propulsion discussion. They look at the owners. These are all small owners with small budgets and small margins to operate in the market. But ultimately, it should be, of course, the engine manufacturers, the shipyard. They should be the ones sitting together ultimately with the entrepreneurial companies and the innovative companies to see how can we drive this change together.
Yeah, I think you pose a very good argument there, and I also think that collaboration is quite crucial in this, both from a shipyard perspective as well as a manufacturer of engine perspective. But how can we stimulate that collaboration and this innovation? Who would like to? Maybe Charlie, would you like to reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think more, as Michael had mentioned earlier, the way banks get involved is very much at the final stages, once there is sort of a final product. And I think it's very much the same on the underwriting side as well, that our role is very much end product. So once there is a fully autonomous craft, that's sort of when we get involved. So I mean, our involvement with sort of stimulating change with regard to innovations is fairly limited, unfortunately, just because we are sort of involved at the latter stages of the process. So it may potentially be one of the other panelists to step in if they play a role in sort of the earlier stages, perhaps.
Well, yeah, well, I think how do you stimulate it? I think maybe sense of urgency. The question is there really an urgency to go to autonomous shipping? If we look at, for example, and I always like to make those comparisons to the propulsion, there's a sense of urgency. Everybody talked about it for years, but now there's really, change happening to see how can we go to emission-free shipping.
Yeah.
Is that urgency there at this moment for autonomous shipping? I don't know. I see many ship owners, nobody's talking about it. And they only started talking about the propulsion a few years ago, which is also a process of years. So I think that is where it needs to start. How will it change the maritime industry? And is it really necessary to change the maritime industry going forward?
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's also in respect to your point where you said that maybe in ferries we can see autonomous shipping, that ship owners there are or ferry companies are more willing to adapt. They see those innovations more positively than.
Well, not necessarily more willing to adapt, but the costs might be lower there because indeed, as you said, financing R&D is not really your niche of the world, but that I think is also going to be one of the problematic areas for shipping. In AI in general, one of the hot areas today is NLP, natural language processing. There are, and that apparently is one of the big issues in AI today, there are only 3 or 4 companies worldwide who have the finances to still train those models, to still develop those models. That costs insane amounts of money. So there, for shipping also, the question is going to be, is it going to be worthwhile to invest huge sums of money in research and development for autonomous operating ships, if then afterwards you have a market of 100 ships a year or something like that? That is unknown at this time.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I received another question from the audience. So, what are the organizations next to the IMO who play an important role to facilitate autonomous shipping if the demand would be there in the market?
I don't want to also answer all the questions.
Well, you're the professor.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't answer this one.
Clearly, one of the other companies or organizations are the classification societies. Ships have to be classed, and there are already several classification societies that are developing rules and standards for even also for partial automation, bridge automation, things like that, engine room automation, and also going to fully autonomous vessels. So they certainly will play an important role. Probably a more technical aspect is that, autonomous ships will rely very heavily on software. How do you test software? How do you certify that a piece of software is indeed working correctly, that it is robust, that it is reliable? Also, there's a lot of that shipping, of course, and the progress towards autonomous shipping. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. They can borrow from the aviation industry. They can borrow from the automotive industry. There's also a lot of lessons to be learned, I think, from safety engineering, because talk about, for example, the COLREGs, the international convention that deals with the rules on collisions. Nowadays, because the COLREGs were written from a human perspective and dealing with ships manned with a human crew, we have this seamanship rule, etc. We have this lookout rule. The reason why we have these rules is to avoid collisions. And in an autonomous future, that basically will have to be translated to a sort of safety thinking, safety engineering. And for those of you who are interested in that, we're basically coming from fail safe. If something goes wrong, you stop in a safe position. We then move basically to fail degraded. So if something fails, the system can still operate. It can still operate, but in a degraded mode. And that's your car only going 80 kilometers an hour if there's a red or an orange light coming on. We're now moving to what is called fail operational. Something goes wrong, and the system nevertheless still continues to operate as it should be within the parameters. There are all sorts of developments that would be useful, but again, the question at the end of the day, of course, is how much is it going to cost, and how much what will the return on those investments be?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the million dollar question of today, quite literally. What is it going to cost, and who is willing to invest in these opportunities? And one of the questions I also had was, is there a role for the commodity trader or the charterer to get them, and how do we get them on board? And I think Michael already addressed a couple of those answers, but maybe you can reflect on that a bit more.
Yeah, well, the cargo owner needs to go from A to B, and they are the ones, of course, paying for the transportation, so that the ship owner who has the ship can pay, well, their equity, their funding in general. So yes, there is a role for them, of course, in this respect. But again, I come on the sense of urgency. Does it for the cargo owner matters whether it's a cruise ship or is it a autonomous operating ship? And I think they will say, what's the benefit for me? We come to the same.
Yeah.
You know, can I have cheaper logistics because of this, or because that is a really monetary element? But if it's more safe, less collisions, more just in time because of this, then it's a longer term, I think, return what they have, which is less monetized, but you know, at least you can calculate what the returns are.
Yeah, maybe in inland shipping, the business case is easier because inland shipping is a more limited environment. You can control it much better. The investments are lower because the ships are smaller. So maybe the first developments or the breakthroughs are going to come from inland shipping rather than from ocean shipping.
Because of the boundaries of operations also, I guess.
Yeah.
If you can operate 6 ships in a river instead of 2.
Yeah, and then you can create the sense of urgency. And then I think the Yara Birkeland, the ship in Norway, that was actually built just to go from A to B. There was a sense of urgency for the company to build it, so they didn't have to drive all around the fjord, but they can just go. And I think that it was because of that sense of urgency that project eventually evolved, and I think they're now doing trials as we speak, which is exciting. But that was a commodity trader just for getting, it was fertilizer, I think, fertilizer from A to B. Yeah, but if it's not there, then it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case.
Yeah.
I think we're coming to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much. Any final remarks you would like to mention?
Well,
you, Frank.
Because you already talked about collaboration, I think there is one important area of collaboration that is a bit lacking and has historically been lacking, and that is between the technicians, the people designing the systems, and the lawyers. Lawyers need to understand what really is happening, and on the other hand, the technicians need to understand at least the basics of what they can do, what is possible within the framework. And I think from our side, from the lawyer side, there's, for example, that's again in inland shipping, there's the Auto Barge project. And if you read the website, you see, we are going to do online, so real-time machine learning. And then everybody says, wow, real-time machine learning. Until you go and check the more detailed, more technical papers behind it, and then what they are going to apply that machine learning for is basically for voyage planning. We leave today in Rotterdam. What is our ETA in Duisburg? That is what they are going to use that machine learning for. So it has nothing to do with collision avoidance, has nothing to do with keeping clear of other ships. And as a lawyer, as a legislator, you need to at least try to understand what those technical people are doing, what AI, what this mythical term of AI, what that really means. Because if you don't understand what is happening, it's all the more difficult to regulated to deal with it in a good way.
Thank you very much. Willemijn?
Yeah, well, in addition to this, I fully agree on the working together, the interdisciplinarity that has to in the sector that has to really start now. And one of the things I find personally is going to be challenging in the future is the moment that I'm in the courtroom and a collision happens, and I have to explain to the court what went wrong with codes and programming and in the software. And that's also one of the reasons why I really follow it, because that is going to happen eventually, that it's no longer or less about the technicalities of the ship, but it's now about programming the software and codation. So it's going to be interesting, but it's going to be challenging.
I can imagine.
Yeah, well, I'm a pragmatic banker, so I calculate everything back to numbers. But, I really hope that people are not discouraged by my number crunching to see how things work, but that they really go out and innovate and research and create this autonomous ship. And there are enough bright people out there. There's enough capital there. If that comes together, I'm sure that we will have a great future in autonomous shipping.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Charlie?
Yeah, I think from an insurance perspective, I think we're more just excited to see how this plays out in a risk sense. Sort of, will the reduction in crew risk sort of outweigh the cyber risks that we face, and just to see how it progresses in 10 years when we've got 100, 1,000 autonomous vessels, what the sort of claims history is like, and whether these are a safer risk compared to an ordinary seagoing ship. And I think for us, sort of, where normally if we're underwriting a 200,000-300,000 pound account, well, that would be exciting. I think now underwriting a small survey vessel for €1,000 is just as exciting now, just to see how the space develops.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I just received the last two questions from the audience that I want to pose here before we wrap up. So, is the current crisis of crew change and wage pressures brought about by the pandemic act as a trigger for more attention for autonomous shipping? Charlie, is that something you would like to remark on?
Yeah, I guess, it'll be interesting to see how with the pandemic and reduced crew, I still think for the time being, a lot of these vessels, even the very small ones, where we'd normally have one or two crew, even if they're going to be programmed, there's not a sense of sort of jobs lost, more jobs just shifted shoreside. So I still think from a crew sense, the risk for us will still be the same. Just if you have two people on board a vessel, the risk for us is still similar in the sense of there is still a crew risk, even if two people are sat in a manned station. If one of them spills a pot of coffee over the lap and burns themselves, that's just as much a claim as if one of them gets their hand trapped in a door or something on board a vessel. So I think whilst the pandemic may change, I think we still that crew risk will still be there to some extent, even if we are sort of shoreside and no crew on board vessels themselves.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think if you look at autonomous shipping, the question is the ship really without crew? Because who's going to do the maintenance on a ship?
Yeah.
Because normally when a ship sails, they do a lot of maintenance. They paint, they maintain. So the question is whether they still might have to use a lot of crew. But I'm sure that if you have less crew and you have less crew transfers in a pandemic, indeed, or in a situation where you can't transfer them, it's always better.
Yeah. Well, and the last question is also for you, Michael. Does NIBC already play a role in generating incentives now? And do you have some examples? I think you already addressed.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I have not seen any request for autonomous ship on my desk yet. We're always happy to look at it, but yeah, like I said, it is a technological development, and normally we at the end of the road to finance this instead of at the start of the road.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And thank you also at home for listening in to this webinar about autonomous shipping. I think we addressed many interesting topics here. We had a great discussion, so thank you all panelists as well. Also Charlie with the live video feeds from London. And I hope to see you again soon at another Rotterdam Maritime Capital of Europe webinar in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.